All right, having taken a look at the Renaissance for some time, let's turn our attention to the Reformation. It'll be known to you from your general knowledge of the history of culture, but also from things we've said already, that you cannot sharply separate the period of the Renaissance from the period of the Reformation, any more than you could separate the period of the Renaissance from the Middle Ages. What we're looking at over this 250-year period is the intertwining of various cultural and ideological movements and ideas. And we are going in and separating out events and thoughts that are uniquely reformational over against those things that had a different flavor and direction and purpose that we have labeled the Renaissance. So having said that, and noting the artificiality of the distinction in your outline, nevertheless, I would like to look at the Reformation. If the Renaissance was the revival of classical man-centeredness, what was the Reformation? It was the revival of New Testament faith and a reaction against humanism. This is interesting. The Renaissance, you see, wanted humanism revived. The Reformers saw humanism in the church and wanted it extirpated. And so there's really an ideological and a moral difference between what we will call the Renaissance and the Reformation. They have some formal characteristics that seem to make them common. They both want to go back, right? They look back to the glory of the past. But you see, that isn't sufficient. You haven't really gotten to the heart of it when you only say the Renaissance and the Reformation want to look back, because the Reformation wants to look back to the founding of the church, to the original documents of Christianity, wants to go to God's revelation, sola scriptura, rather than listening to the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. Whereas the humanists of the Renaissance want to get away from the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church, that they might go back not to the New Testament, but to the pagan Greeks. So while the Renaissance and the Reformation overlap geographically and chronologically, it's rather obvious that the reference point for the Renaissance and the Reformation were quite different. In the Renaissance, the reference point was the humanistic ideal of man as the center of things, and man as autonomous, whereas in the Reformation, the reference point centered on the infinite personal God who has revealed himself not only in nature, but redemptively in the Bible. So we have a different reference point. Is it man as autonomous or God who reveals himself? There's a different attitude toward reason between the Renaissance and the Reformation. In the Renaissance, which is really growing the seeds that had been planted by Thomas Aquinas, man's reason is not terribly affected by the fall. I'm not sure it would be entirely fair to say that it was unfallen in their view, but nevertheless, it's not so fallen as the will of man and other things that man cannot begin with himself. Man can trust his reason. The Renaissance says, take it for granted your reason will lead you to the truth. Begin with yourself, the Renaissance says, and by your reasoning ability, you can devise answers to mankind's greatest questions. But in the Reformation, man's reason is just as fallen as is man's will or his emotions. And so the Reformation does not begin with the reasoning ability of man as self-sufficient and autonomous. It begins with the idea that the reasoning ability of man is being put to an unethical purpose. And it itself is distorted by the fall and needs redemption. The third point of conflict in terms of the criticism of tradition. In the Renaissance, there was a critical attitude toward the accepted traditions of the Middle Ages. But tradition was criticized because it didn't hold to the autonomy of human reason. In the Reformation, there's a critical attitude to the traditions of the church and the distortions there. And that leads the reformers to say man needs not to trust his reason, but to submit to the revelation of God in the Bible alone. So even in their dual critique of tradition, Renaissance and Reformed thinkers are different and what they propose as the solution. There's a different view of man. In the Renaissance, we see Renaissance thinkers begin with man is great, man is central. In the end, man has no meaning or value, objective value. His world is disjointed, without any kind of unity. In the Reformation, we begin not with man, but with God. And in beginning with God, we can explain the meaning and dignity of man, as well as why man has the problems that he does. Let's compare nature and art. In Renaissance perspective, art gives nature its proper emphasis, but then leads to the problem of how can you find meaning for these details. In the Reformation, art gives nature a proper place, but as the creation of the infinite personal God. And so there is meaning in the natural world, there's significance in the natural world, because it's been created by God and for His glory. Or consider the question of freedom, political, social freedom. Both the Renaissance and the Reformation were interested in producing a culture that was free of tyrannical domination by kings. Both introduced freedom. But as Schaeffer indicates, the Renaissance concept of freedom, especially in Southern Europe, often degenerated into license and anarchy, because humanism had no way to give meaning to the particulars and no way to derive absolutes by which the particulars, individual men, should live. There were no values. The Reformation could introduce freedom in the political order, but do so by standing under the authority of the Bible. And so the freedom that is introduced in a biblical approach to politics does not lead to license or anarchy or a failure to find absolute values. So what I'm getting at here, what Schaeffer is trying to communicate to you, is that the Renaissance and the Reformation had the same basic problems, but in very crucial ways they had opposite answers. And the Renaissance and the Reformation led to opposite results. And so we've been looking at A in your outline, the contrast between the Renaissance and Reformation. Let me speak more specifically now, B, about the revival of New Testament faith and the Reformation reaction against humanism. What is the teaching of the Reformation? There are forerunners, of course, of the Reformation in the late Middle Ages, men like Wycliffe and Huss, and somewhat Savonarola, but the Reformers specifically propounded as a distinctive over against the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church, one, that the Bible is our sole final authority. There are not two ultimate authorities, the Bible and the tradition of the church interpreting it, but rather the Bible alone. Secondly, the Reformers taught that salvation comes only through the work of Christ and not through the works of men. Only the Bible is our final authority, and only the work of Christ is our final hope of salvation, not any work that we may do. And thirdly, Reformation distinctives are summarized in what is now called the Priesthood of All Believers. The idea that there is no special dignity or religious significance to being a person that works in the church, like a priest, but rather all of God's people, be they cobblers or fishermen or farmers, are priests before God and must pursue their vocations to His glory and under His direction, so that the man who grows wheat is just as religious as the man who dispenses the bread of life in the church. They are both priests before God. One's calling is in the area of the church, the other's calling is in the area of God's world, but they nevertheless are equally religious. It's not as though one is more important than the other. So let's talk about these three distinctives in a little more detail. First of all, the Bible is our sole and final authority. According to the Reformation, the Bible is the Word of God in all that it teaches, and the church must live under the authority of the Bible. The question of ultimate authority in our philosophy of life, then, is not divided between the Bible and the church, but this institution that is charged with proclaiming the Bible itself must be governed by the Bible. Those with a reformed approach to life believe that the Bible gives them truth. Not all the truth, but nevertheless genuine truth about what is unavailable to human senses, the truth about God. We can know true things about the God that we do not sense because He has revealed Himself not only in our own being as men, but in the world in which we live. We have absolute truth about the ultimate unity of life, the ultimate meaning of life, the ultimate value. We have absolute truth about God. Moreover, the Bible gives us not only absolute truth about God that unifies life and provides meaning and value, the Bible gives us truth about people and about the natural world. We understand why we exist, what man's place in the universe is, why we have the form we do, how we are supposed to live our lives, what the natural world is there for, and why it is studyable. Pardon the terrible English there. We know why it is studyable, why it's accessible to man's reason, and we know that we've been called to exercise dominion in it. All of this is given to us in the Bible. By beginning with the Bible, we have a worldview then. We know the invisible God who provides the unity, purpose, and meaning of all things, and we know what this world is all about as His creation and man's place in it. And so when the Reformation says we begin with the Bible, and the Bible is our final authority, it is our only final authority, this doctrine of sola scriptura is philosophically significant. When we talk about John Calvin in a few moments, I'll draw this out even more. Reformed philosophy does not begin where the Greeks do, with the unquestioned assumption that man's mind is normal, with the unquestioned assumption that whatever is real all exists on the same level and can be understood by the same principles, with the unquestioned assumption that man in his natural state has a pure interest in the truth and is not distorting the truth as he goes along. Reformation says, no, we begin with the Bible because only that corrects our distortions. Only that corrects our misperception of the truth that comes about because of sin. Only that provides a unity, a universal, broad enough to explain what the meaning of life is and how everything relates to everything else. Okay, let's look at that second Reformed distinctive. Salvation is only through the work of Christ. Now, if we're right in seed form here, I've suggested that the Reformation conception of sola scriptura provides a worldview that answers these philosophical problems that are around. Naturally, we have to ask the question, well, why don't men just of themselves come to those truths? As I've said, the Bible tells us we come into this world unable to figure things out. We come into this world not only with dark hearts, but with hearts that suppress the truth and therefore are led into darkness and ignorance. We are fools, to put it very simply. So you hand the truth to a fool and it does you no good. God has handed the truth to fools. The world all around us tells us about God. We know we're supposed to start with God. We know that we live our lives to serve His purposes. He is the unity. He is the absolute value, on and on and on. We should know all that, but we're fools. What does Paul tell us in Romans 1? Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. That's right. Remember that if you ever have to take a class at the secular university. It's not professing themselves to be wise, they went out and proved how smart they were. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And so we need a way back to God. We're not able to take the truth that is so abundant and available to us and make good use of it because we're suppressing it in unrighteousness. And we're not even self-conscious of our suppressing it. We think we're all very innocent. We believe in God and we would have this Christian worldview if the evidence was there. The Bible says we've got an axe to grind. And we're suppressing this truth even while we think we're being innocent. And so, to put it very simply, you can't do philosophy unless you deal with the problem of man, the man who's doing the philosophy. You can't do philosophy until the problem of sin has been dealt with, until you are enlightened. And this is the key to I hope you find it clever enough to remember. This is the key to my next point in the outline, 2 kinds of enlightenment. See, philosophers will tell you, you need to love wisdom. That's what philosophy is, right? Phileo, Sophia, the love of wisdom. Phileo, Sophia, philosophy. And to love wisdom, one must be enlightened. But we believe that. We think we're supposed to love wisdom. In fact, if you heard me at the convocation service the other night, you know that Proverbs 1 has God as personified wisdom calling out to men to love Him, to follow Him. That's a feminine personification there. She holds out her hand, she extends it, she wants men to come and follow her. We're supposed to love wisdom as Christians. And we believe the only way you can love wisdom is if you are enlightened. Since we come into this world as fools in darkness, we need the enlightening of God. Now, doesn't it stand to reason? Doesn't it just make sense to you that if we begin our lives in darkness with an axe to grind, rebelling against God, spiritually dead, unenlightened, if we begin as fools, can we correct our own problem? Can we just take this natural foolishness we have and use this foolishness to make us wise people? Can we take all this darkness we have and create light out of it? No. If you begin with the Reformed conception of man as fallen, then you don't believe that you can get philosophical enlightenment apart from what? Regeneration. God must take the initiative. God must change our lives. And, moreover, it won't do any good for God to enlighten us if the guilt that has put us into this darkness remains. God must take care of the problem of man's guilt. And therefore, the whole scheme of theology, which you probably will have an entire course in, or you can spend a life studying, and you hear preached all that, the whole scheme of redemption that is proclaimed in Reformed churches is philosophically significant. It's crucial. The second distinctive of the Reformation that I've given you, salvation comes only through the work of Christ. This is important philosophically. Individuals, according to Reformed teaching, do not need to be tyrannized by the authority of the church, either in its declarations or in its sacraments, as though we cannot be right with God apart from being right with the Pope and his minions. Rather, individuals can come to God directly by faith through the finished work of Christ. And no one can add to that finished work. Our enlightenment, our regeneration, our salvation has nothing to do with our accomplishments. We cannot add to the work of Christ. He has done it all. And therefore, the work of Christ is accepted as a gift. And those who accept it have been changed by the grace of God. This emphasis in the Reformation that salvation is only through the work of Christ, therefore, is a key to doing philosophy properly, because it's the only way back to the light that enlightens everything else and makes sense out of the world, man's place, and the meaning of his life. Well, then how should we live our lives? If we see the ultimate authority of God's revelation and the necessity of God's saving work through Christ, the Reformation, as I indicated, taught the priesthood of all believers. As Schaeffer says, previously, people were separated from the altar in the church by a screen, and only the priest went to the center of worship. Only the priest went beyond that screen to the altar. I remember that very vividly. I grew up in a Roman Catholic community, and when I was in high school, one of the part-time jobs that I had was delivering flowers. And the very first time I went to the Roman Catholic, whether we had more than one, but the one major one there in town, to deliver flowers, I had to call ahead to get somebody who was a Roman Catholic to take the flowers up to where they were going to be near the altar, because you have to understand, I don't have the right as a Protestant to be there. Well, as it turns out, the people don't have the right to be there. Only the priest has the right to be there. Now, what did the reformers do? Well, they removed this screen that separated the people from the altar, and they put in the place of the altar where the sacraments are celebrated, what? The pulpit. And in so doing, what they said is, everything's opened up to all of God's people on the basis of God's Word. Isn't that beautiful symbolism? We all come to God, and the Word is central. We're not screened off from the altar. And all of us must now take the Word and live our lives out of it. We are all priests. We hear the Word of God. We go into the world to live the Word of God. It's not just these people who do the hocus pocus, of transubstantiation and the Eucharist in the Roman Catholic Church. We're all priests. All right. Christianity is reformed. What you find in the Reformation is the revival of the faith against humanism, rather than, as in the Renaissance, the glorification of humanism. What are the effects of the Reformation? What is the work and the outcome of the Reformation? Well, as I've said, if the Reformation is seen as a reaction against the distortions of humanism, whether they're secular or religious, then at the core of the Reformation is a removal of those humanistic distortions that had entered the church. And the reason why the Reformation focused on the church is that the problems in general culture and man's understanding of himself would be corrected if the church preached the right things. But since the church is not doing that, then the church needs to be reformed. How had the church become so bad? Well, the authority of the church was made equal with the Bible to begin with. You have the Bible, God's revelation, that is the source of our enlightenment, that should give us our philosophy of life, but the church has raised itself up to be equal with the authority of the Bible. Now, when the church becomes equal with the authority of the Bible, it shouldn't surprise us that about the same time, the work of Christ has added to it the work of man. And so where Christ alone saves us, the church begins to teach that men can add to the work of Christ. They actually can merit the merit of Christ. And I want to make sure you understand this. I know you're going to have theology classes, but we need just a few moments. Because often Protestants will say, well, the Roman Catholic Church taught salvation by works. Well, just about any astute Roman Catholic will say that's a slander. That is not true. We do not teach and did not teach salvation by works. What Protestants should mean by that is what they did teach amounted to salvation by works. But nevertheless, when we point to Bible verses that say salvation is by grace, Roman Catholics will say, oh yeah, we believe that. It's what they add to that. It's what they add to that that in a sense takes away the affirmation in the first place. Let me sit back and explain. According to Roman Catholic dogma, the work of Christ, and only the work of Christ, can atone for our pre-baptismal sins. Prior to the washing of baptism, nothing can take care of our original sin or any of the particular sins we are guilty of, except the work of Christ. But now somebody who's been washed by baptism, when they sin after that, then the justice of God calls for a penalty, right? And the penalties of God are both eternal and temporal. Now, only the work of Christ will satisfy the eternal justice of God with respect to our sin. But we all need to be disciplined when we have sinned. Let's say that I have been rude to my neighbor this morning. Well, the civil magistrate doesn't have the right to come in and rebuke me for being rude to my neighbor. And I don't live at home anymore. My parents don't rebuke me for being rude to my neighbor. But God's displeased with me being rude to my neighbor. And so there is a certain temporal guilt that I have for my sin. So how am I going to deal with that temporal guilt? Well, quite obviously, the justice of God would require me to confess the guilt and to do something to counterbalance it, to satisfy the justice of God. And so what I do is I go to a priest, and in the privacy of the confessional chamber, I say, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, and then I detail for him what it is, and he says, all right, then you do the following Hail Marys, and et cetera, and God will be satisfied. Well, you might say, I don't know, I don't really like this. I think I'll just skip all this temporal judgment stuff, and I'll just go to heaven when I die. And the pastor says, no. If you have not taken care of the temporal guilt, you can't enjoy the eternal. And so, since there are people who will make the mistake, having been baptized and not dealing with their temporal guilt, God, in His mercy, has instituted purgatory. Isn't that wonderful? Where you turn the mercy of God into something that horrible. Purgatory is, as the name tells you, the place where all this temporal guilt is purged away. You need to realize purgatory is not part of hell, and it's not on the road to hell. No one who goes to purgatory is going to hell. Purgatory is the vestibule of heaven. And God wants people to suffer before they get into heaven. Is any of this beginning to seem outrageous to you? God wants you to enjoy His grace and mercy by first suffering in purgatory. Which is it's necessary because you didn't go to confessional, you didn't take care of the temporal guilt of your sin. Now, let's say you go to confessional and it turns out that what you have to do, either you don't do, or it's just too much, it takes too much time, or if you die before you get it all done. Isn't God good? He says, that's all right, I'll still let you come to heaven. First, you'll have to suffer first, have to make up for all this. Or, hey, how about this? This is a great idea. God says, you don't have enough good works to counterbalance this guilt, but there are certain special individuals, they were really good. In fact, they not only did all that I called on them to do, they did over and above what I called for them to do. They got an A+ above grade level. They did what are called works of supererogation. These are the works above works, the super works. Now, when they enter heaven, you see, they've got an excess of merit on their account. So what God does is He says, well, what a shame to have to close this bank account with all this excess merit. I'll scrape off this merit into the treasury of merit so that people who don't have enough good works can make use of the merit of the saints. This is amazing. You see how the grace of God works in the Romanist scheme. God says, I'll use the merit of the saints in your behalf. Isn't that wonderful? One might have thought, just as an aside, that the merit of Christ was perfectly sufficient, and I don't need the merit of the saints, but you see how the scheme all develops. It's pretty, point by point. The transitions are obvious. So, God has all this excess merit. How is He going to distribute this merit? Well, He needs a representative, right? If you had invented something and you wanted to get it out to people, you would hire somebody to get, your invention out, your new medicine, whatever it is. Well, similarly, God needs a representative on earth for the distribution of the merit of the saints, and He chooses the successor of Peter to do that. Okay. Now, the successor of Peter has got to get this merit out to people. Let's imagine that you are a student of Dr. Bonson's and you didn't get your assignments done. And so you got a failure. And then you decided, because you didn't think it was good to have on your transcript, that you really wanted to go back and make that right. So you come to Dr. Bonson and you say, forgive me, Father, I have sinned. Yes, my son, what have you done? I did not do your homework. Huh? You did not do my homework. So, well, what you're going to have to do then to make up for that is you're going to have to do 10 term papers instead of 1. Okay? Then I will know that you are very serious about this. And then you say, oh, but my Father, I don't have time to do 10 term papers. I could not even get 1 done. What will I do? I will die in my failure. And then I say, no. I have had better students than you before. They wrote more term papers than they needed. They did works of supererogation. And I could only give them an A. There was no way to give them more than an A. And so what I have here is I have excess term papers that are all A work. And for a price, they are yours. Now, does that not seem gracious on my part? I am only selling these term papers for your good. Now, you know that I'm doing this tongue-in-cheek. I find it absolutely abhorrent that the day comes when men say, we will sell you the merit of the saints. You may have an indulgence in your sin and therefore not have to go through purgatory and may enter heaven directly. Not only that, the question arises, why does God show favor to some men and not to others? The Roman Catholic theologians had to account for that. How does God show to some but not others? And the answer that they developed was, some men have a certain condign merit that makes them worthy of God's attention. That is, they have a merit that is appropriate to God's attention. And so I've already demonstrated in terms of the congruent merit of man's works, how Roman Catholics can say they've preached the grace of God, and yet it turns out that you can't get into heaven without doing works. I mean, that's pretty clever, isn't it? When you can take something and turn it into its opposite. We preach the grace of God, but step by step, as I've explained it, the grace of God turns out that you've got to do works. Now, these works, it turns out, are never quite appropriate. They don't fully accomplish everything, but nevertheless, the merit of these works is congruent with the merit of Christ. But it turns out there's another doctrine of merit in the Roman Church that's just as bad, and that is the condign merit of God that is given to those who have shown by their lifestyle that they are worthy of salvation. Don't waste time on the losers. God says, I'll go for the people who are most likely to be religious and to be saved. Yeah, I know that's very ugly as a bottom line, but that is what Roman theology teaches. And then one more step in this perversion of the grace of God. Now it turns out that the one who has condign merit and is going to be justified before God and then do works of congruent merit to satisfy the temporal justice of God, avoid purgatory, go directly to heaven without passing go, and so forth. That this person is justified not by the work of Christ imputed to your account, but you are justified by the infusion of the righteousness of Christ in you. That is to say, when God looks at a man and decides whether he is just or unjust, God can only declare you just if you truly are internally changed. And so justification must be God's infusion of the righteousness of Christ into the sinner. The reformers all cried no. When God justifies the sinner, he does not infuse the sinner, he rather gives the credit, the merit, if you will, the record, the legal status of Christ to the sinner. So it's as though, see, a judge has all these files for every individual who lives. I can give you an earthly analogy. And when the judge opens my file, what he would find there is a record of guilt. The judge does not find in the file my wicked heart, does he? He just finds my track record. That comes, of course, from my wicked heart. In the case of justification, the Reformers said, when God opens the record for me, the merit of Christ, the righteousness of Christ has been placed in my file, so that I have the gift of his righteousness. That has nothing to do with the condition of my heart. When the judge looks at my legal status, my file, he doesn't see my inner soul, does he? And so in justification, God is declaring us righteousness. He is declaring us just for the sake of Christ's righteousness. And the Reformers all easily demonstrated that the verb to justify, does not mean to make someone just. In the New Testament, we find that people justify God. That can hardly mean that people make God righteous. In the New Testament, we read that justification stands over against God's condemnation. Well, given that parallel, if justify means to make righteous, then to condemn must mean to make guilty, to make unrighteous. And no one wants to say that of God. So, in the Reformed conception, justification must mean not meriting the merit of Christ, but being imputed with the merit of Christ. That's what I was getting at. The infiltration pattern of humanism is first the authority of the church, is raised to the same level as the authority of the Bible. And then we get the merit of sinners being raised up so that it's congruent with the merit of Christ. But the Reformers wanted none of that kind of humanism, where man has authority and value and ability in himself. And so you have Farel, for instance, opposing humanism. As Schaeffer says, the statue of Farel marks the characteristic of Reformed Christianity. The Bible held aloft over the head as the supreme and only authority. The Reformers even opposed the Christian humanism of someone like Erasmus. What did Erasmus teach that Luther found abhorrent? He taught the free will of man. He taught that men are basically good, they are innocent if nothing else, and that men, as the Roman Catholic Church had taught, can merit the merit of Christ. And over against that, please make my day, what was the title of Luther's treatise? He taught what? The bondage of the will. The reason why it's by grace alone is because the will of man is in bondage and only God's initiative can break the fetters. So Reformed Christianity, I realize this may seem like we've descended into a class in theology, but one of the things I'm trying to illustrate for you is that at least this philosopher doesn't buy this distinction. Theology's up there dealing with grace, but in philosophy we get, down to objective reality in the world. I don't buy that. I don't buy the idea that reason operates on its own out here, but there's also the faith we have to get into heaven. I believe that faith is foundational to our reasoning, that theology provides the answer to our philosophical questions. Or as Dr. Van Til likes to put it, theology and philosophy address the same questions, but they do it in a different vocabulary. They do it with a different audience. But it's the same questions and the same answers. So the work of the Reformation is philosophically significant. What are the results of the Reformation with respect to man and nature? The results of the Reformation with respect to man and nature. Well, as I've said, the Bible gives us genuine truth about God so that we have a universal and objective value and a unity to the world that He made and the life that we live in it. Because we see a unity to life in God's creation and providence, we therefore believe science and art can operate on a biblical foundation. Now, I'm really reversing the kind of argument that you'll ordinarily hear. Most people will tell you, if you go to the Bible, then you won't be interested in art, you won't be interested in science, because you'll just be, all tied up here in just your little religious revelation. What does the Bible teach us? When you understand what the Bible teaches about God, about the world, man's place in the world, the meaning of life, the calling of man, and so forth, the Bible, you see, is not only the philosophical precondition of understanding the world in man's life, it is the impetus to getting out and understanding the world and living our lives to God's glory and showing the glory of God in our artistic works and so forth. So the Reformation had a positive, not a negative, a positive influence on science and art. With respect to man, Reformation teaching gave meaning to the individual, to the particular man. Because in the first place, men are not absorbed just in the work of the church. The Bible can explain why individual men do great things. How can a Michelangelo do this wonderful work? How can a Bach or a Beethoven write a symphony the way they do? Well, the Bible says man has dignity because he's made in the image of God. If you think God did a good work, and we're His image, then we can do good works too. Not good works meritoriously. We can do works which are artistically and scientifically good. And after all, since all vocations now have dignity, all of God's children are priests before Him, they hear the preaching of the Word and go out into the world to apply it, then there's an impetus to do good work even if you're just a cobbler. Those who write symphonies, those who discover medical advances, those who are farming, those who are making shoes, they all wish to glorify God. to live subject to what His Word says, and to do their work to bring glory to His name. Moreover, the results of the Reformation with respect to man show that all men are equal before God, and in the church, you don't exalt one over the other. Now, does this mean we should all be Anabaptist? We should all, hold a view of church government that doesn't say that there are officers in the church? Absolutely not. But notice this distinctive. In the Reformation, at least as it comes to expression through the Calvinistic wing, the Reformation, those who govern the church govern because they are chosen by the people. But they may not govern the church unless they are qualified, and the hierarchy, the previous hierarchy of the church, certifies their orthodoxy. So you do not have, in Reformed Christianity, with respect to the government of the church, either an all-out democracy, where the people have their way no matter what, nor do you have a top-heavy tyranny, where it's only those who are already in the club choose those who will be in the club. You have, to put it more philosophically, you have the proper balance between the one and the many. The law and order side of things, the previous hierarchy, as well as the many having the freedom to say which men they will be subject to in the Lord. And so Reformation Christianity, in its view of man and the government of the church, has explosive consequences for the reformation of society as well. No longer would the divine right of kings have a stay of life when Reformed people know that even in the church they have a say in the choosing of their leaders. And this is not just Presbyterian prejudices coming out. I hope that you have noticed, if you read the U.S. Constitution and the form of government we have, that there are strong parallels to Presbyterianism there. See? Where did people get that idea? Well, if you buy the story that John Locke and his friends, just ignoring any Christian influence, came up with this on their own, you are naive. In fact, I'd like to tell you about Santa Claus and a bridge I have to sell and so forth. That came from Christian influence. Not perfect, not pure, not simple necessarily, but when all is said and done, the bottom line is the Reformation provided the seeds for social reform. The Reformation provided the foundation and precondition for scientific advance. The Reformation, you see, could show why we can put an emphasis upon nature and details and study the relationships of people to one another without losing absolutes. Reformation could explain why men are great and can do good things. But the Reformation, twice as good as the Renaissance, not only could it explain the goodness of man, it could explain why men are wicked too. So here are men who have the ability to study the natural world, and what they do. They master the natural world so that they can kill each other. And I'm not some kind of raving peacenik and so forth. I'm here to teach you. But when people point out that we've mastered the atom, for instance, and then we made the atom bomb, they make a good ethical point. Why should it be the case that when men come to master nature, they turn it to destructive ends? The Bible tells us, see, this is not peacenickism. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 2, we should look for the day when men will take their swords and beat them into plowshares. That we should use our ability to have dominion in this world not to fight with each other destructively and wickedly, but use it positively to produce things and to glorify God and to serve His people. And so again, I realize you hear this from people that may not be all that commendable in their philosophy of life, but they make a good point. How can men who are good and smart and able to have this kind of control of nature, why do we do so many bad things? This last year, where I preached fairly regularly in Orange County, my first sermon of the year was a protest against humanity. Basically what I did is I said, I am fed up with all of this mamby-pamby, humanistic garbage about how men are basically good. And then I just took the newspaper for 1992, and I said, Look at this story, look at this story, look at this story, and so forth. And you can do this throughout history, too, not just 1992. What I want to know is, if you think men are basically good, okay, you humanists, you Renaissance children out there, please explain to me why people engage in serial murder, why in some countries of the world, warlords let people starve to death when they don't need to. Why you have children killing children, and on and on and on. You see, the interesting thing is, Reformed Christianity can not only account for the greatness of man and what he can do, can also account for why he is such a horrible, wicked person. See, and that's why the grace of God has to be preached. You can't figure out life until you deal with the redemptive problem as well. That is not somehow, oh, that's church stuff now, Dr. Bunsen. That's theology. Let's get back to philosophy. I'm doing philosophy. I'm trying to explain to you why men can't get things figured out, why they can't live together in peace. I'm trying to explain where moral absolutes come from and what do we do when it turns out we have violated those moral absolutes. Okay, so with respect to man, don't you see, the Reformation is not just an ecclesiastical reform, it's a philosophical reform. And it has marvelous consequences. Schaeffer looks at them, and we'll look at them in a little more detail ourselves. Well, let me move on to art. The results or effects of the Reformation in art. For reformers, those with the Reformed outlook, art has religious significance, not merely aesthetic significance. But that doesn't mean that art is only usable in the church or in Sunday school material. And we're not saying that art must always have an explicitly, quote-unquote, religious, church-oriented, or redemptive theme. Art portraying the world that God has made is legitimate. But even that is religiously significant. Now, the reformers, so happened, have a history, a reputation for destroying artistic images. So, how many textbooks on Western history will then say, see, the Reformation was like fundamentalism. It was anti-culture. Because the reformers destroyed these images. So Schaeffer does exactly the right thing. He points out, you know what images they destroyed? The ones that were at the center of religious idolatry. They did not destroy them because they were art. They destroyed them because they were idols. Now, maybe you think they went too far. I think there were certain excesses and so forth. But I don't make the mistake of thinking they were against art. They were, with all their heart and soul, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and therefore didn't want these idols that had brought people down to be in the way anymore. So when they destroyed art, they were destroying the religious, anti-religious, actually, significance of those artistic pieces, the statues of Mary and so forth. Let's note the positive influence of the Reformation on art and culture. Schaeffer points to Cranach in his portrait of Luther, who was a friend of his. Consider the Geneva Psalter and what that meant for the Reformation of music. That Luther was a musician. In fact, he wrote the preface to the Wittenberg Gesangbuch. Think of Buxtehude's Abendmusik, the hymns that come out of the Reformation. Culture not being restricted to the elite. People should be able to sing to glorify God and to sing in church. Or even more, the work of Bach. The testimony signatures of Bach bring tears to my eyes. Here is perhaps the greatest musician in the history of the Western world. And he wrote these pieces to the glory of God explicitly. Handel, who put the Bible at the center of his great musical compositions. Dürer, who took nature seriously, painted biblical themes, who was interested in the treatment that was being given to Luther because he believed Luther's theology. Or Rembrandt, my favorite. I mean, that's a subjective remark. But, everyone grants the grandeur of Rembrandt, explicitly reformed in his convictions. You see his Christian testimony in the painting, The Raising of the Cross. You see the psychological depth. Rembrandt knew both sides of man. his grandeur as well as his evil. Consider the results and effects of the Reformation in the scientific world. When I gave you your reading assignment last evening, I thought 3 chapters would be more than enough. Do you recall that I told you Schaeffer wrote his book in a somewhat, what we would consider unorganized way? Well, it turns out that he discusses this particular theme in chapter 7. Okay? And so you will not have read it. If you want to, turn in your book to chapter 130. I'm just going to go through real quickly and summarize what he has for us here, because he doesn't restrict himself just to the time of the Renaissance and Reformation. He finally comes up into the 20th century as well. But the point that he's trying to make here in chapter 7 is that the rise of modern science is tied to a worldview which only Christianity could make sense out of. I would advise you to write that sentence in your notes, because I think that's the precise way to put it. The rise of modern science is tied to a worldview which only Christianity can make sense of. That is different from the claim that all the modern scientists were explicit Christians. They may not have, or they may have had, certain problems in their theological expression. But the point is, no one would have been interested and therefore able to pursue the advances in science if they couldn't make sense of this world, if there was no philosophical preconception that permitted study, experimentation, and generalization. So Schaeffer tells us at the beginning of the chapter that almost simultaneously we had not only the Renaissance and the Reformation, but what is called the scientific revolution. He suggests we date the rise of modern science from Copernicus. Of course, you know from my lectures that we did a little more detail on that. It's not up here on the board today because I've limited space, but please remember that those names in those 2 columns. You have all of these people intertwined, the philosophical and the political and the scientific, and it's not just like in one little segment of time. Anyway, he chooses Copernicus as his jumping off spot. He points out the Chinese developed very few scientific theories. They had scientific insights, but they could not theorize about the world in the way that it works. He looks at the Arabs at the bottom of the page, and he says, like the medieval Europeans, their science was an aspect of philosophy, meaning the exposition of Aristotle. So they did science not by observation, but by authority and an interpretation of their authority, Aristotle. So that it says the foundation for modern science can be said to have been laid at Oxford when scholars there attacked Thomas Aquinas' teaching by proving that his chief authority, Aristotle, made certain mistakes about natural phenomena. Then he mentions Roger Bacon. You all know the name of Bacon. We spent some time on him. He mentions Protesta. We haven't spent much time there. I would probably not give that much emphasis to him, but nevertheless, what he says is these scholars opened the door to less restricted thought. And then he talks about the Roman Church attacking Copernicus and especially Galileo. And he says this is because Aristotelian elements had become part of church orthodoxy. He reminds us that Galileo defended the compatibility of the view of Copernicus with that of the Bible. So those who make, the Galileo incident a conflict between the Bible and science have missed the point. It was a conflict between the church, found by Aristotle, and Galileo, who went to look at God's world and said, hey, you're wrong. On page 132, he discusses Francis Bacon. Let's see if we get this right. Francis Schaeffer discusses Francis Bacon in his battle against the old order of scholasticism, his stress on observation, a systematic collection of the data, information, the emphasis of Galileo and the new telescope. And then in the middle of the page, let me read. The rise of modern science did not conflict with what the Bible teaches. Indeed, at a crucial point, the scientific revolution rested upon what the Bible teaches. And then he cites 2 men, neither of whom are professing Christians, Alfred North Whitehead and J. Robert Oppenheimer, who have stressed that modern science was born out of the Christian worldview. On the next page, Schaeffer explains, this does not mean that it's only Christians who can do science. But when non-Christians do science and are successful at it, they cannot give an account of their success. They cannot explain why the world is amenable to the study, experimentation, and generalizations that they have. Therefore, when non-Christians do science successfully, they are philosophically living on borrowed capital. That is, they're really using our philosophy of life, all the while denying the, if you will,